Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters for Monotype, a show where we meet the people designing the future of creative work and shaping our culture. I'm Carl, and I'm your host this week. This week's episode is a fun one. Our guest is Sarah Hyndman, the founder of Type Tasting and the author of the best-selling book, Why Fonts Matter. Type Tasting is a unique enterprise, I guess you would say. So what Sarah has done is really created a program of sort of presentations and talks that really dig into the way type influences our sensory perception. So how does typography influence how we hear things, smell things, taste things? How does it change our expectations of something based on the way the type looks? So an example would be on a candy bar, the type reflects the sweetness, the nuttiness, etc. of whatever is inside. And what happens if you change it to something completely unexpected? What does it do to your brain? What does it do to your experience of tasting it for the first time? Sarah Hyndman, she's been a friend of Monotype for a long time. We've collaborated with her many times for the past 5, 6, 7 years. And we are super excited to have her on this week's episode and for her to share her love and passion for type with you. We are also excited because we have a debut host today in the form of Rebecca Price, our senior brand manager. Bex, as she's affectionately known in the Monotype virtual office, is one of my favorite people to work with. She has full of energy and love for type and for Monotype. So Bex and Sarah, take it away. And listeners, I hope you enjoy the episode.
Hi, and welcome to Creative Characters. I'm Bex Price, and today I am so excited to be joined by the acclaimed and brilliant Sarah Hyndman. Sarah is the author of several books, including the best-selling Why Fonts Matter. She is a public speaker, a graphic designer, and host and founder of Type Tasting, immersive and interactive events which introduce and elevate the importance and psychology of fonts. Sarah, hi, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, it's an absolute pleasure to be here.
It's so nice to have you. I'm so excited to dive into this discussion today. I'm absolutely fascinated by the work that you do, and I know our listeners will be too. So I thought it would make sense to kick off by, if you could start by telling us a little bit about how Type Tasting and Why Fonts Matter was born.
Oh, so it all started back in 2013 when I'd been a graphic designer for 10, 20 years, running my own business, and just decided to take a year out and to explore something that I felt I wanted to kind of dive into a little bit further. And I've always been really interested in typography as a graphic designer, but I didn't feel like I knew enough about it. And I'd also become really aware that whenever I was presenting to clients and they would say, why does that mean that? Or why does that represent that? I would always say, oh, because it does, or because it always has. So I took a bit of time out to go and do some exploring, to start looking for research, to start reading some books, and they kind of didn't really exist. So I ended up just doing lots of my own games, demonstrations, bits of research. And once I'd started collating them, it sort of made sense to write the book that I'd wanted to read so that everybody could share in all of this. And I just self-published it to start with, just sold 2,000 copies, and then Penguin picked it up, which was really exciting.
Amazing.
And as you can tell, my 1 year time, my 1 year out has lasted a bit longer.
That's so fascinating. I had no idea that you weren't necessarily a specialist in typography before you took that year out. I knew obviously you were a graphic designer and had run your own company for 10 years, but I had no idea that it was that foray and that year out that really started everything off.
And I think that's why I've been able to ask so many questions, because also I'm a self-taught graphic designer. I studied sciences at school, so I haven't come through that formal being taught what you're meant to think about typography. So I just ask loads and loads of annoying questions. And when I can't find the answers, then I go and find a way to get other people to help me discover the answers.
Amazing. I love that so much. And I think obviously reading your book as well, it's just littered with psychology studies and scientific studies and all of the references. And I've always been sitting at reading it, thinking the people that you've spoken to and the contacts that you've made to uncover all of those studies is fascinating. So that was just kind of off the bat of you asking questions and trying to find the answers.
I felt it's really important to get beyond the design world. So so one of the things that I really want to do is make typography exciting and kind of sexy beyond the design, beyond the world of academia or specialists, because every single one of us interacts with type, with fonts, with lettering every single day of our lives. And it seems really strange that only experts feel empowered to talk about it. And I felt really intimidated by the topic. I still get imposter syndrome very, very regularly when I meet what I feel like are the real experts. And I think it's just one of those topics. So I'm really keen to make it accessible, to make it fun, and to empower everybody to talk about it.
I love that so much. And actually, I wanted to ask you about that, about making it accessible and making it fun. But I will get into that a little bit later. I wanted to ask you, first of all, about type tasting, because I know that we at Monotype had a brilliant presentation a couple of weeks ago where so I sat in one of your audiences before the pandemic. And I also had the online type tasting, and they're just so brilliant and so engaging. Talk to us a little bit about how that came about and what kind of studies and questions you ask people.
Thank you. I'm so pleased that you came to a live session before we did the online one. That's really exciting.
I know, it feels like a million years ago now.
What was such a challenge was working out how to make these incredibly interactive live events work over Zoom. And after kind of a bit of trial and error, I think it works really well now. So type tasting, it came about, so it was part of this year out. And the idea behind the name is so wine tastings are a way that you can learn about the very complex topic of wine in a fun and social way. So my idea was that type tastings should be a very similar thing. And of course, anything where we can be social and have a few drinks while we're learning is always fine by
always fun.
So from the outset, it was always meant to be a really interactive, really social, and really accessible way where people could come and just talk about type, but also explore it in different ways. And so also just this idea of getting beyond the design industry is why I talk to experts from so many other fields. So chefs, psychologists, perfumers, just lots of different people who understand about how communication and all of our senses and how nostalgia are wrapped up in all of our everyday experiences, and how type, I think, is just a part of that. It's kind of the gateway to a lot of these experiences. A lot of the time, it's the introduction, it's the packaging or the sign it's the first thing you encounter before you have the experience. So it's very wrapped up in it.
It's so interesting talking about the senses. I had heard you talk about a study that suggests that we are more creative. I can't remember what the percentage was, but we are more creative the more senses that are involved in an experience, which I just thought was so fascinating. And you were talking, you mentioned about drawing, and obviously creatives drawing and using paper. But in a world, especially in the last year, that we're using screens so much, I think perhaps we don't realize how much we've lost that sense of the tactile sense of design and creativity. And that was fascinating.
It's a thing that I've been really conscious of from right at the beginnings of moving these onto Zoom, is how can I carry on building in all of these sensory elements in some way. So I used to take people on tours of signage in Dalston in East London, which is where my studio is. So I began by doing these online. And the way that we brought the sensory elements in was just to do lots of descriptions, to ask people lots of questions, get people to talk about memories and nostalgia. But then as they've gone on, I now send out a BYO menu. So even if you're coming to a very sensible session, you might still be asked to bring things to smell or to touch or to eat. And I kind of incorporate all of these into the events, because this is just a really good way of bringing them to life and making you feel like you're not on Zoom anymore. Because if we were in a real world situation, we wouldn't just be staring at a screen.
Exactly. And so can you take us through a couple of the tests that you do?
So I have a whole pile of games and demonstrations that I bring along to different events. One of the ones is the jelly bean experiment, which is based on what has actually now turned into a scientific study, which has been co-published with Professor Charles Spence from the University of Oxford. I mentioned it in Why Fonts Matter and that was before we'd actually published the study, and it was when I'd just been brave and stood on a stage. And with the jelly bean demonstration, you eat a jelly bean and you look at a particular style of typeface and you think about what it tastes like. You then eat another identically flavored jelly bean and you look at a different style of typeface. And for a lot of people, it will actually make them aware of different tastes in the jelly bean. So it gives the illusion that it might change it from sweet to sour.
Wow.
Which is lots of fun. And once you start demonstrating these things, it's a really good kind of icebreaker, because you can then say, okay, so if type might be influencing your sense of taste, then what else might it actually be influencing, or what else, not in a dark, sinister way, but what other things might it be priming you to be slightly more or less aware of in your everyday experiences?
That's incredible. Did you find that the answers were unanimous across the board of people leaning towards sweet and sour?
No, there's a really wide range. Around 2/3 of people will experience one typeface making it sweeter and another one making it taste sourer or more bitter. Varying degrees. Some people are like, oh my goodness, that's such a massive revelation. Others are like, yeah, a tiny bit of difference. Other people, it's completely the other way around. And of course, some people don't experience any difference at all. We all have different sensory dominances, and it's such new science. Nobody really knows. And my end of it isn't to understand the science of why, it's to understand and explore how type does this, and just to use it as a fun demonstration.
That's so interesting.
Thank you. So another of the games I take a lot of the time, which is a really good one for bringing up the subject of context, is I have a pile of records that I take to lots of different events. I sometimes do this with really big audiences. So I think one of the last live talks I did, we had a couple of thousand people in the audience putting their hands up and shouting and voting for what they thought. And I'm going to do this on you. And also, Bill is the producer in the background, so I'm going to rope him in to ask this as well, to answer this as well.
I'm breaking the fourth wall here to come in and participate. So I'm ready for you, Sarah.
I always think that we should always break these walls.
We really should.
So I have this is one of the records that I would take. So, and what I will do is I will ask everybody in the audience to tell me, what kind of music do you think is on this record, judging purely by the letter on the label. So I've replaced all of the labels on my record collection with single letters in a typeface. So if you look at that typeface, Bex, what music do you think that is?
So for the listeners, I'm going to describe it. It is a Gothic, I would describe that as a Gothic style letter S, and almost kind of bridging on the black letter marker. I would say my initial answer was rap or hip hop. But then there's something else in the back of my mind, and I don't know whether it's because I've been influenced by something else. But yeah, I would say rap, probably.
Cool. Bill, how about you? What would you say?
So rap did not enter my consciousness when I saw this letter form. In fact, I'm thinking this is like hair band 80s rock and roll kind of music.
Really?
Hair metal.
Hair metal, yeah.
And so this is what I found. So the first time I ever played this game, it is heavy metal on this album, on this record. It's actually Motorhead. And I took it down to play it with all the guys at It's Nice That. And so, of course, they are probably, they're a little bit younger than me. And when they put the record on and put the headphones on and listened to the music, a couple of them kind of looked me up and down. And I could see they were thinking, oh, you're quite old, aren't you? And what I realised is that our answer actually says so much more about our own experiences, our own associations, where we've come from, where we've grown up. So the way that we link music to these different letter forms is purely from what we've experienced. So when I do this for a really big audience, you'll have lots of people shouting out different answers, knowing that they're right, but then hearing all of these other different answers around them and realizing actually everybody's right, but our answers are kind of different. And it's just a really interesting example of how context is absorbed, or how context is so influential when we're thinking about typefaces.
You know what's funny about that, actually, Sarah, is when I give that answer, I spent a lot of time living right on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles, where Whiskey Go Go is, and all of the kind of premier rock clubs of the 70s and 80s in Los Angeles, and I just associate. I immediately that went to my mind, but that's a part of where I lived, so I could see why that would have influenced the way I would think about that.
And so for you, it's in fact not your age; it's the location. So I put this out on social media, and I've had such a wide range of answers, and they range from things like Wagner and classical music all the way through to rap, hip hop, Mexican ska, just such a wide range of answers, because type is kind of like a sponge.
So, Sarah, you've done live events and now your type tasting events online. What has it taught you about humans in general? I mean, gleaning all these answers from people, have you found that it's teaching you a bit about the psychology of how we associate, or demographics and buckets of people?
I think from talking to lots of different people, it's made me love type even more. It's such a joyous thing, especially to speak to children or people that are so far beyond the design world, who have this moment of revelation when you ask them a question and they say something like, okay, what kind of pub do you think is under a sign like this? Or what kind of shop? Or would you let me show you this font? Would you go on a date with it? Can you tell me its personality? Can you tell me its backstory? And everybody can. We can all fill all of this in. We just might not have thought about it before. So starting to ask lots and lots of a really wide range of people, it's fascinating to actually see how many associations everybody has, and also how, as designers, we've kind of learned what we're meant to think. And sometimes this gets a little bit separated from what the rest of the world might think. So typefaces don't come with instructions and back history when you just see them out there in the wild. And I think as a designer, that has been a really, really good bit of learning for me, is to just ask the wider range of people. And also just how much humor there is. It's a subject that we take very seriously, but actually people put, especially when you're talking about personalities, people put all of the quirks and all of the idiosyncrasies that humans would have into typefaces and typography, which I've really enjoyed.
It's interesting about designers versus non-designers. Have you found a marked difference between the types of answers that you get?
Yes and no. So designers, we will use lots and lots of terminology. We also get quite self-conscious about making the right choices that we think we're meant to make. So with designers, I'll get you to pick your first choice, and then I want to know what your second choice is, so that we can just get Helvetica off the table, just get the neutral out of the way. Whereas somebody who doesn't feel like they've got any expectations, they will actually just answer really, really instinctively. And if Comic Sans is the answer they want to give, they will absolutely give that. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And it's just lovely being in a space where you don't have to feel self-conscious, and where everybody is just sharing this joy of these shapes and how they link to their memories, and they link to like maybe childhood memories of sweet wrappers, or times that they've been traveling somewhere, or that food, that ice cream that they really, really love.
It's so true with the references. We had a similar situation in my household last week, and sitting around the dinner table, and I was talking about your work, and I got your book out and was presenting it, and I actually did your who would you date, which typeface would you date? I did that test on my family, and it caused quite a stir because people picked things that they then decided they weren't happy with. Anyway, it was really wonderful to see amongst the people around my table who don't interact with fonts and still think that what I do for a living is just sort of mystifying. And so it was wonderful to put your work to them and see it firsthand, I suppose, and that it was exactly that, the accessibility, and it is demystifying and opening that conversation, and also realizing how much, or making people realize how much they already know about type, exactly as you say, that they have just absorbed. the piece that I also wanted to ask you about is Comic Sans and just using it because you like it. Reminded me of the brilliant story of the scientist.
Yes, I mean, I don't want to spend too much time talking about Comic Sans because otherwise it just hijacks the conversation. But when CERN announced the discovery of the Higgs boson particle, the God particle, which is pretty much one of the most momentous scientific discoveries in our living lifetimes before vaccines were invented. I'd say that's actually a greater scientific discovery. But when CERN made the press to announce it, all of their slides had Comic Sans on them. And of course, Twitter was then up in outrage about this, and it ended up trending much higher on Twitter that Comic Sans was being used than the actual discovery itself. And when the woman who runs CERN was asked, she was like, well, we used it because I like it. And then other scientists have just said, well, no, but it was just handwriting. We're not designers. We're not trying to be pretentious and choose typefaces and typeset things. We just want to write our results on our slides, and Comic Sans is exactly the one that fits the bill. And I think that's just a lovely example. It kind of doesn't matter. It was the right typeface for the moment for them.
The moment, exactly. I love that story. So, Sarah, how do you, with the research that you've done, how do you make typography accessible for clients or for students in terms of the language that you're using? And I ask that because it's something that we've actually found with our studio team working with clients, that they will have clients in a room and they'll be being taken through a creative brief, and the clients will be potentially intimidated or daunted that they won't be using the right terminology or it's too technical. And something that the team really encourage is to just say what you feel. And I think it's something that is hugely prevalent in your work. So I was wondering how you find using that.
So it has been a really interesting, I guess, unlearning curve. So when you're a kid, children's books have really exciting, expressive type. I used to spend my life doodling on my school books, from bubble writing to David Bowie logos. But then as you become a designer, you get taught how to take typography seriously. You get taught how to use all of this big language. And it's really hard to then unlearn it to talk beyond the design studio. So as soon as I started doing my research, I knew that I had to ask non-design or ask people outside of the design world. And as soon as I started doing it, I discovered I can't use any of the language that I've been using for the last 10, 15 years of my career. And just from talking to so many people, I've kind of learned to use less of the jargon and just make things really, I guess, experiential and visceral. And exactly as you say, just ask people how they feel. But then also to put in different contexts. If you just say, how do you feel about that typography? That's really intimidating. But if you put it in context of, as you were mentioning earlier, if you were going to go on a date with that typeface, what kind of person would it be? Would you be proud of it? Would you sneak them in behind your parents' back? The minute you put real world scenarios onto things, you're then taking away the technical jargon and you're introducing a whole new familiar set of language. And that makes things much, much easier. So another of the experiments I did from really early on is I have lots and lots of jars of things that smell, and I get you to match smells to different typefaces.
I love that.
And it's really bonkers. There is no right or wrong. You don't know what you're meant to think. So it doesn't matter whether I do this with designers or with the wider community. Nobody knows what the right answer is. But then I can ask you lots of other questions about the smell. So what mood does it evoke? What memories does it trigger? But then that will actually relate to the typeface. So it's a really roundabout way of getting questions, but by bypassing people's kind of intimidation threshold.
That's absolutely brilliant. And in a way, it's exactly how you experience type in your life day to day. You're always overwhelmed by senses, whether you're sitting reading a report and it's the coffee that you smell, or if it's walking down the street and it's reading signs, or walking down a supermarket. So it makes totally logical sense that you would attach additional senses to that experience.
Absolutely. And there's a thing that one day we will be able to change this. If you think about music or food or fashion as as amateurs, as people who just experience them. So I can wear clothes and I can talk about the fashion I love. I can eat food and talk about the food I love. I can listen to music and talk about the music I love. But I can't look at typography and talk about the type. See, we don't even have the language to describe it. It doesn't allow the people who experience it to talk about it and enjoy it. And I think that's the thing that we need to change.
So that's exactly the point I wanted to ask you actually as well. It is, on one hand, it's this missing language, and perhaps the world of typography is sometimes behind this sort of cloak that it's not accessible for everyone day to day. But another thing I wanted to ask you was about, again, it's the psychology of type, but if you think about the psychology of color, I think it's another area that people are so much more comfortable with, and people seem more comfortable to talk about, oh, I would never paint my bedroom black because that would make me feel X, Y, and Z, or I would never paint my kitchen pink. We all have that association, and yet again, type is something else which we don't have, and yet we interact with it at every single point in the day. Every piece of information we're taking in is a font in some respect. So it is interesting. What do you think the answer is? Do you think there is an answer?
I think loads and loads of research has been done into colour psychology. It's something that we all know that yellow makes you happy. And I think also it's a really good point that I'll come back to in a minute. Please remind me too, about cultural differences as well. But because we've always had access to choosing colours, whether it's I'm choosing a colour that I'm going to wear, or whether it's the colour I'm going to paint my home, humans have always chosen colour in different ways. Even if it's going back to, I guess, cave paintings, you've chosen the colours you wanted to paint your paintings, whereas choosing a typeface or a font is such a new thing. So when I was a child, a book came in the typeface it came in. There was no question about me changing it. But when I talk to quite young children, or teenagers now today, and older, in fact, they will talk about reading on a Kindle, and they will very naturally say, oh, I switch the font depending on what kind of thing I'm reading. I make it look really intellectual if I'm reading a certain kind of homework book. I make it look really fun and friendly if I'm reading something else. So they've grown up knowing that you can change different typefaces. So I find there's so much more awareness. And so I have events in my studio, these open studios, and you'll get the parents and the children coming along. And the parents try to kind of font-splain to the children, and the children are like, no, we know it all already. So it's kind of really good fun.
Changing gear a little bit, I wanted to talk about the Venn diagram that you showed us on a recent type tasting you gave us at Monotype. You showed us this wonderful Venn diagram and talked to us about the sweet spot for brands. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
So I started using a Venn diagram system, which began when I was running workshops, and it's now a system that I also use myself. And I find it's a really, really useful way, both for explaining and also for making my own decisions. And it's especially useful now, as Charles Nix, who's one of the Monotype designers, talks about us being at the waning days of a mega trend. After 2 decades of sans serif are no longer the dominant typographic landscape, and typography is now becoming so joyous with all of these different styles there for everybody to use. But I'm also quite aware of, and I get asked so many times by different people, is we don't know where to start. It's like sans serifs were kind of this safe space, and now we've got to look at all of these different styles. Where do we start? So the Venn diagram system begins with thinking about your brand or your product. So as a designer, that's obviously the starting point. So what are we about to brand or rebrand? And then the second stage is to think about the category expectations. So this is the competitor research that we all go away and do, and all of those mood boards and your bar charts and everything, working out exactly where you sit on this landscape. But then now adding a third kind of piece into the process, which is also to think about, what do people care about today? And especially, what do the audience or the consumers of your brand care about that overlaps with what you as a brand also care about? And how can you use in this case, typography specifically to reflect this, but you can just in terms of design, the whole strategy, where does what you care about overlap with what your customer cares about? So in terms of typography, do you all care about brutal honesty, absolutely saying it as it is? I'm going to tell you what you need to know, not just what you want to know, in which case you're probably going to want to use type styles that kind of warn you in advance, we're going to tell you the truth here. So these kind of instances are where we have been seeing the kind of really sharp, angular kind of wedge-shaped serif typefaces turning up. Maybe what you have in common is you want to feel human. So you want a tone of voice, or you want a brand that tells you that you both have some kind of shared human connection, which is something that is really important to everybody at the moment, especially since COVID and community has become really important. So if you want to represent how being human is important, then you might want to look at some of the, what I call blobby serif style of typefaces, ones that feel a little bit more hand written but still have a little bit of formality to them. So looking at where these areas of overlap are, and then finding the typefaces that speak that language. And then also the way that you can find these styles is a lot of the time they don't come from your own category or the category that your brand is in. You might want to look around at other categories. So thinking about humanness and these blobby serifs, they began in the world of food, in fast-moving consumer goods. But now we see them, for example, MailChimp uses a very blobby typeface. So this is a tech brand, but it's using it in a way that says, we're speaking like a human, not like a robot. And so it's hopped from one category where it's become really, really familiar, and it's hopped into a different category where it feels authentic because it's being used in an authentic way, but it feels familiar enough because it has already been established in a different category.
I find it absolutely fascinating, and I'm particularly interested in how you can build layers into the personality of a brand. And in our studio, when a brand will say, like you said, we want to be human, we want to be approachable, we want to be innovative, and they're very specific buckets that you're asking to translate through your type design. But actually what's underneath that layer, and if that's really obvious and people know that you're innovative, or your audience know that you're human, what's the next layer down, and how can you use the type to subtly convey that, which it seems is exactly what the formula that you've come up with.
So the question I've been asked a lot recently is, how do we convince our tech clients not to keep using geometric sans serifs? And it's exactly what you say there, because the fact that they are a high-tech brand is already a given. We already know that. You don't need to communicate that through your branding. You can now communicate the next level or the next layer of your personality and the thing that is actually going to connect with your customer. So yeah, I completely agree.
In terms of connecting with the customer as well, an example that I find quite interesting is looking at the trend that happened sort of 2 years ago now. After 2020, I've kind of lost all sense of space and time. But yeah, 2 or 3 years ago, the enormous trend for high-end fashion brands and fashion houses to move from the heritage script, and they all moved to sans serif logos. And I find that really interesting because I'm not well versed enough to understand what it really does to our psychological understanding of that brand. But for us, they've always been these heritage brands that we've kind of known for decades. And what does that do to the customers association when they make such a huge jump in a rebrand project like that?
Oh, so 2 sides to my answer. I think the first side of the answer is, if you're a huge super brand, you can kind of do anything with your logo. We still know who the huge super brand is. It's only the less known brands where the logo introduces the brand. It's like Google can mess with its logo and do kind of whatever. And so I don't think the huge fashion brands are really harming themselves in any way. But what has been really interesting, and I accidentally saw this trend happening a little bit earlier through some of the games that I play in my events. So since starting type tasting, so 8 years ago, I have this game called The Price of the Typeface is Right. And I have this big deck of cards, and I get you to shout chap higher or lower and arrange them in order of expensive to cheap. No context. It's just which is the most expensive, which is the cheapest. And we end up with an order. And generally at the bottom end is something that looks like VAG rounded or Arial rounded. So the one that looks like the child's felt tip pen. Although if I do play this game with under 12-year-olds, they think that's the expensive one because that's the language of children.
Brilliant.
And generally, for about 6 or 7 years, the top end was always, in this instance, Dido. So a modern serif with little hairline serifs, the kind of typeface that we would associate as being the little black dress or the cocktail suit of the typography world. And it's also what you would see in lots and lots of fashion logos. But then in the last, I guess, 3 years, that started to change. And especially when I played this game in the US, especially West Coast, suddenly the sans serifs were moving up and this modern, or what I started calling the bling typeface, was moving down. And so as this, what I would call bling typeface, has been moving down, I started to ask various people why. I didn't really understand why. And some of the reports that the trend forecasting agency put out, they've been talking for the last few years about how in the West, we've started to feel uncomfortable about ostentatious shows of bling, of wealth, and how wealth is becoming more understated. And so suddenly it made sense that these bling typefaces are moving down that scale and the more neutral sans serif typefaces are moving up. And so then looking at this change in the fashion logos in context of all of that, it's like, so we don't know really what the next incarnation of showing off or of bling is. So the fact that they're going sort of taking almost this holding pattern maybe and being neutral, I think is really interesting. But if you look at tech logos, they're all lowercase, wide-eyed sans serifs that kind of look very, trust me.
Very approachable.
Yes, and friendly. Whereas the fashion ones, they're bold, uppercase, look at me, I'm on the catwalk, I'm still demanding your attention. So even though both are doing neutral sans, they're doing it in quite a different way still.
And another example that you mentioned in our type tasting presentation which really stuck out with me, was that apothecary style in design for the beauty industry. And I was thinking about that and associating it with perhaps that time when the beauty industry was sort of revealed for hiding a lot of its costs, a lot of its marketing costs in the price of its products, and how it was perhaps reflected in the design and stripping it out. And I certainly am to totally fall for that apothecary style in beauty. And it is interesting to watch how we then become so accustomed to that style of type, and then reassociate it with an industry.
And I think it's not just the beauty industry, that whole clean label trend, we see it across pretty much all sectors. And it's, I think, especially during COVID, that whole idea of things being medicinal and honest and open and looking trustworthy, I think, has been really important. It's also interesting that there have been discussions recently about how that's a very Western way of designing, and how design should maybe rethink always being minimalist and modernist and start being a little bit more inclusive of design styles from a broader cultural range, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. That is very interesting. So the workshops that you had run, or you mentioned you ran with creatives within organizations, and that you looked at the psychology of communication and taking that apart a little bit more, not just specific to type design, but also the psychology of communication in general. So how they are, I imagine, communicating with their audience.
So I do a really wide range of workshops, and when I work with the design studios, these are the workshops that are looking kind of at the psychology at the moment. So the main workshop is one that I call Decoding Type Trends. And so we look at not just what the trends of the moment are, but we step back and look at them in context of what's happening culturally and ask why these trends appear to be appropriate and authentic now, why they wouldn't have been in the past, why they might be changing, and dive into all of this with other designers where we can all kind of geek out together and really just talk about type. And I also do workshops where we will have all of the departments from a company. So you've got the design team, but then you've got all of everybody. Sometimes the legal department quite often are the people that will end up coming back afterwards and saying, oh my God, we actually changed the way we now create our documents after this workshop. And the really great thing about doing it for the entire company is I can present things in a way and I can use language that makes it accessible to everybody. The design team gets a chance to actually listen to the kind of broader answers I get when I do my games and my demonstrations with a wider range of people. And everybody can just go away feeling a little bit more empowered. Also, everybody gets to understand that actually using the voice of your brand coherently across an entire company is actually quite important.
It's amazing to see that light bulb moment go and think, oh, wow, I could do this. And as you say, breaking down that barrier and empowering people to use fonts and use type in a way that they would never have considered before, or use it at all if you've never considered, like you say, in the finance or legal department. It sort of becomes this chore that the brand police call you up and give you new templates to use every couple of months, and you just want to get your work done.
And I think that's exactly it. It's rather than it being the brand police, making it a conversation that everybody can be a part of. And so I ask you what you think and what you feel rather than telling you what to do.
You mentioned recently that it's an exciting time to explore how type reflects culture right now. And I wondered what you had noticed over the past year in this new landscape that we're living in and what we've lived through. How have you seen trends change in type?
This last year has been a really interesting time for having conversations about type, partly because so much has changed so quickly that whole idea of technology has accelerated so much. But also for me, because I've been doing workshops online and anybody can come to them from anywhere in the world. And I always build in an extra 20 minutes, half an hour at the end of a session for a conversation. So my idea is we can still pretend we're going to the pub after a talk. But what it's meant is that we get people of all ages and backgrounds sitting effectively in the same room talking about things. So students will bring up questions about cultural appropriateness of a typeface, and then somebody who's a much more mature designer, maybe from another country, will say, oh, but I always use that. And then they have a discussion and both go away going, I hadn't really thought of it that way, but now I'm going to. And I think so much of what's happened in the last year has really blown open conversations about assumptions that we make, about biases. And it's just opened up this curiosity where we can now start saying, well, why do we associate that with that? Or why does a famous actor's son putting that word in that typeface on a t-shirt suddenly cause outroar on Twitter when a different word in that typeface on a bottle of beer would just be like, oh, that's nice beer. And we're now having these conversations, and I think they have to be had. I think typography is the language of culture. So it completely makes sense that it reflects these trends, it reflects the attitudes, it reflects the associations. And once we start unpicking it, it's kind of fascinating.
What role do you think type can play when we're thinking about pandemic times and essentially experiencing so many brands through a small rectangular screen? When you take away the other element of human interaction or out in the world, how do you think that brands can use type to build an authentic connection with their audience?
That's a huge question for a very tiny little computer screen. All I can do is answer from my own personal experience, which is that object might look like a tiny little screen, but the minute I look at it and engage with it, it fills my entire awareness. So I forget that it's a tiny thing. And if I look at a logo to a brand that I have a relationship with, then it's more than just that icon. So it's the entire relationship I have with that brand, and I will click through and interact with it more. So I will need to know that, firstly, if it's a fake, if I've been phished and I've been sent off to the wrong website or something, just instinctively I will know if it's slightly the wrong typeface, that it might feel something might feel slightly wrong. You might not necessarily know it's the wrong typeface. And also just in terms of a brand, speaking authentically, using type that feels authentic, not just slapping the latest trendy font on its branding and then expecting me to go, oh, okay, we're being friendly now. Or, oh, okay, we're being high tech now, are we?
Yes, exactly. I'm fascinated to know, just as a small question, but with all the research that you've done, which typefaces do you choose for your own books and your own work and your own presentations that you give in type tasting?
My main body copy typeface has always been Franklin Gothic, and I probably won't change it. My reasons for that are I use so many different typefaces that I need something that's neutral enough that it can sit and hold all of them together. But I really like that Franklin Gothic comes from the late 1800s, and it has those really traditional double story G's and A's. So it just has that little nod to traditional, I guess, knowledgeable type. But my favorite reason is that it turned up a lot on the kind of scandal sheets of the 19th century. So it, for me, it's just don't take it too seriously, because it was also used to communicate kind of scandals and outrage. So I kind of like that.
I love that.
And I use things like Caslon Graphique as my main typeface, just because I like it and it looks a bit sassy, and it makes me think of kind of the divas of those amazing women who would walk on stage and steal the show. And even though that's not me, it's kind of method acting, I guess. That's the me I would like to be on stage. And then I just also have fun. Every now and then there'll be a typeface that I love, so I kind of have fun playing with it. So at the moment, Audacious and all of their lovely glyphs has been really fun. And then also Magnet by Yona Plinnings, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, with these amazing back slants I've just been really loving recently.
Oh, so nice. I love that. Talking about the diva as well, it reminds me, obviously, a huge part of your work is fonts having personality. I absolutely love that. It's a diva walking on stage. It's exactly what anybody needs when they're about to walk on to give a presentation. Absolutely.
Just seeing how, again, everybody has an opinion. You don't have to be a designer to have an opinion about these things.
So what's next for Sarah Hyndman and typography and for type tasting?
Ooh, it's going to be a really fun, exciting time. We've got loads of everything from type is moving, all of these. Suddenly everybody has permission to play with different styles, and now we're working through styles looking historic and now moving beyond that. Just seeing all of these mashups and exciting things happening it's going to be really fascinating to watch. And my predictions are no better than anybody else's. In terms of type tasting and what I'm doing, I guess as hopefully COVID is starting to, well, at least in the UK, where things are opening up again and we're thinking about events in real life again, it's time to rethink again. Am I going back to what I was doing before? So life on Zoom doesn't have to continue. I can actually go out and have legs in front of people, not just be kind of from the waist up. So very seriously, I'm starting to look into how do we do hybrid events? How do I get back out in the real world, do all of this experiential stuff? I've got a couple of book proposals that I'm now going to have time to put together. I've been asked so many times for the sequel to Why Fonts Matter, and I now know exactly what I want to put in that book. So that's the proposal that's happening.
That was going to be my next question, is there going to be a sequel to Why Fonts Matter?
Yes. Well, one way or another, if a publisher, it's really hard to get a publishing deal for a book about typography. I have to actually self-publish it first and then show that there's an audience for it. And then, but you never know. So I think it'll be good. Because I've spoken to so many people, I have a really clear idea of what people might want in this book. And I'm not going to say it out loud yet. And also just some other ideas. I'm going to start doing like monthly zines, and I also want to start doing a weird monthly tasting menu where each month you'll have this little DIY thing to go and explore type in context of an era and some food that you can smell or eat or drink. It's going to be a bit bonkers. So just explore some stuff.
My last question, Sarah, is what advice would you give to designers or creatives or even to students just starting out on their journey with typography in how to use type to connect with an audience and how to use type authentically?
With students, I would say enjoy it. Don't feel intimidated. Just have some fun. And as soon as you fall in love with type, then you'll start learning about it. Just stop it being really intimidating. And I think with everybody, to ask more questions. Don't assume that the way it's always been done is the way it should be done. And to also bring everybody into the conversation. So clients, all of the other departments, and ask questions in a way that everybody can feel connected to or can feel like they can be empowered to answer, because that can be really revealing and really helpful and insightful in shaping some of the choices that we can go on to make. And as the typographic landscape is changing right now, just enjoy it and have as much fun with it as we can.
I think that's great advice. Sarah, this has been really wonderful. I feel like I could talk to you forever. I've got so many other questions that I think I would go down a real rabbit hole of the emotion and psychology attached to type. But thank you so much for speaking to us. And hopefully we can join another type tasting soon. I'd love to do that again. So hopefully we can. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. To learn more about Sarah and her work, visit typetasting.com. You can also check out our blog post about her at monotype.com/podcasts, where you'll find links to all of our previous episodes and blog posts about all of our previous guests. If you're enjoying the podcast so far, we'd love to hear from you. The best way to do that is to drop a rating and a review at whatever podcast platform you prefer, and subscribe to the show and share with your friends. Creative Characters is a production of Monotype and Christopher Sound. We'll be back with more episodes soon. See you then.